Today I continue learning English with friends flirting with police. So in this clip, Ross and Rachel was driving uh, with Ross, but she was speeding. That's why she got a call from the police. But she is pretty. She tried to flirt with the police. She told him about her weird dream last night that she was stopped by a police an officer, and then she tried to flirt around like, oh, you don't she called him Professor Handsome, but in reality his name is Hanson. And then he compliments on her nice picture, and they are talking about horoscope. And but Rachel's day of expiration date on the ID gone expired. When expired, that's why Ross was handling the stick. And then Ross was so scared, he drove so slowly, and then he got stopped by another professor. The thing is that Ross was copying exactly what Rachel had done before, but he still got a ticket for driving too slow. So let's dive into the clip and study. Vocabulary. I get right on that. I get right on that. Expression used to say that you will do something immediately. Ross is being sarcastic. I get right on that. I get right on that. Roll out of bed, roll out of bed. This means that she left her bed in a very casual way without taking care of her appearance. You can also say to jump out, fall out, etc. Roll out of bed. In the meanwhile, during or in the intervening time, in this case, it means until you resolve this issue. In the meanwhile, handle a stick. Expression used to ask if the person can drive a manual car. The stick is referring to a gear stick. 10 and 2 o'clock position, the name of the correct position to hold the steering wheel when driving a car. This is something you learn at driving school. Official pretty, double meaning. Petty also means not really serious or important. In this sense, Ross has committed a petty crime by driving too slowly. You have a son. Rachel is making Ross feel even worse for his manual immature behavior by reminding him that he is a father. Pronunciation. Was I going a little too fast? Was I going, not going, but going? Was I going a little too fast? Can I see your license, please? I probably shouldn't tell you the rest. I probably shouldn't, not shouldn't, but shouldn't. I probably shouldn't tell you the rest. I probably shouldn't tell you the rest. Probably wondering about the all day. Probably wondering, not wondering, but wondering. Probably wondering about the all day. Probably wondering about the all day. Probably wondering about the all day. You're not gonna speak anymore, right? You're not gonna speak anymore, not any, anymore, right? You're gonna speak anymore, right? You're not gonna speak anymore, right? Oh my God, so hard. You're gonna speak anymore, right? You're gonna speak anymore, right? Anymore, right? You better let him drive. You better let him drive. You better let him drive. Does he have a license? 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 Remind me that I introduce you to someone. Remind me to introduce you to someone. Remind me to introduce you to someone. You're not gonna give me a. You're not gonna give me. You're not gonna give me a. You don't want to hear about. That's it.